revisiting ways of knowing in Latin America, its contradictions and future possibilities. Meaning comes to us through the relationship that the body maintains with the environment. The language, which is already there, present, gives, through its metaphysical powers, the possibility of new meanings. Therefore, it always guides the or a refeeling as a re-existing. When at the end of 1920s, Oswald de Andrade put Freud at his place, repression and Catholicism, he wanted to develop a psychological and psychoanalytical theory that made sense for the freedom of the fellow tribesman, the other, the savage, and his relatives. This has not been accomplished yet. At the same time, when the elaborations of Oswald agitated the cultural world, there was a local intellectual reflections in Brazil practically invisible today, producing a consistent thought in the existential-phenomenological philosophical field, Farias Brito, in the psychology and sociology, Manuel Bonfim, or in psychiatry and psychology, Juliano Moreira. All these authors have studied the place of the human spirit in historical and universal reality. Their analysis seems fruitful for all those who want to test categories that do not take cultural specificities and local experience by imposing a universalism from above. However, let us look with a critical focus. These three texts are also imbued with the moral conception of the 19th century, the theme of national identity and the eugenic conception of sanitation. Revisiting these texts means, for these presentations, on the one hand, affirming our intellectual independence and overcoming the deficit condition in which local thought has been condemned, and on the other hand, explaining the experience of living in the real world. To express in full philosophical autonomy, the colonized people of the world must abandon their colonial mentality. This will be concrete only through a material and cultural revolution against the imperialistic power. Except for the word revolution used above, that was already the proposition of Franio Coutinho presented in the first Inter-American Conference of Philosophy in 1943. I use the word revolution for what Coutinho stated for total behavior and culture, and that beyond individualistic expressions like arts, music, or poetry. Therefore, welcoming foreign currents of thought, again with Coutinho, based in cooperation and friendship. End of quote. That means the domain of knowledge is political. So Coutinho argued against the colonial mentality in philosophy where, Coutinho said, even the reaction against one foreigner current is based on another current equally foreigner. Let us take a major example from a Brazilian perspective. The most influential philosophical movement in Brazil was positivism, and at the same time, one of the highest achievements in philosophy and in the problems of knowledge in Brazil was made by a wild anti-positivist named Raimundo de Farias Brito, born in 1862 and dead in 1917. We can situate Farias Brito in the avant-garde of Western philosophy and in the autogenesis of Brazilian self-awareness, say Luiz Alberto Cerqueira, in Maturidade da Filosofia Brasileira. For Fred Gillette's term, 1925-2006, professor of philosophy at the University of New Mexico, in his thesis Existence in Search of Essence, Farias Brito's Philosophy of Spirit, published in 1961, showed that Farias Brito, in his motives and in his interpretation of the human situation, social and individual, is a parallel from a basic point of view with existentialism, and that there is, in the methodology proposed by him, and in the philosophical program announced by him, a parallel with phenomenology. An important aspect of Farias Brito's philosophy is this conception of psychology as the science of the human conscience, refuting a scientific psychology that tries to reduce human nature to a psychophysiological analysis. The subjective dimension of human experience, the metaphysics, is a practical experience that cannot be reduced by the vices of the modern thought. Farias Brito say, the illusion of each system is its fixity. A prejudice found in positivist vision that contributes to the development of psychology as a psychology of brain. Farias Brito tried to solve metaphysical problems through psychology, identifying metaphysics with science of the spirit, a spirit that must be understood as something that encompasses the entire field of subjectivity, experience, feelings, perceptions, reaction, action. Psychology is the basis of all scientific knowledge. When Farias Brito criticized modern science and positivism, it is possible to say that he was also criticizing the exclusion of psychology. The young Brazilian Republic, founded in 1889, adopted positivism as a state philosophy. The motto in Brazilian flag, Order and Progress, has its origins in Auguste Comte's motto of positivism. The reform in education proposed by the Brazilian Republic was seen by Farias Brito as an attack and destruction of the philosophical education, imposing a technicist vision over an ethical vision of the society. He said, when someone tells me about the wonders of modern civilization and reminds me of the telegraph, electricity, steam, air, navigation, etc., I cannot help myself but be moved, recognizing man's dominion over nature. But at the same time, I feel that my enthusiasm freezes when I see that the number of those who suffer increases instead of decreasing, and that lepers, cripples, beggars, and above all, mad people appear everywhere, making the crime statistics more and more terrifying. Farias Brito outlined 1. The state orients the core of the curriculum, meaning the science and politics walk hand in hand. 2. Constate that science is not engaged in social change, contribute, for example, to reduce inequality, etc. 3. I quote Farias Brito, philosophy, science, religion are therefore living manifestation of the spirit, natural and organic, necessary and fundamental. Farias Brito stated that in Brazil, the psychic element is treated only from a medical point of view. The only psychology that has been judged worth of study is that of the insane, he said. Despite the rich theoretical elaboration and local context, the intellectual production and ways of knowing Brazil is still dependent of external theories that, on one hand, ignore the local intellectual production, and on the other hand impose a epistemic colonialism that's often hidden. In the beginning of the 20th century, it was in the Faculty of Law in São Paulo that psychology started to gain importance, becoming a discipline required for the admission. As said Farias Brito, indeed, it has been almost exclusively in the faculties of law that the science of the philosophical and psychic order have been cultivated among us. This is natural too. Law is, in itself, a psychic science. It is an applied science that's based on psychology. And under the same conditions that engineering is based on mathematics, under the same conditions that medicine is based on natural science. But it was conservatives, Catholics, and even fascists that had appropriated the thought of Farias Brito and transformed him into a hero of their aims. In the first decades of the 20th century, the psychic phenomena explained by biological causality prevailed in Brazil. The biologism, eugenic, is the cultural aspiration of psychiatry founded on an ideological and scientific basis. Juliano Moreira, 1872-1933, was still a teenager, 14 years old only, when he started the Faculty of Medicine of Bahia. He is considered the founder of psychiatric discipline in Brazil and the first to popularize psychoanalysis in the country. During his entire professional life, he was confronted with the structural racism of Brazilian society. He was black. It's important to know that from the 19th century until the first decade of 20th century, Brazil was defined primarily by race, attributing the degeneration of Brazilian people to the miscegenation was a reality. Moreira contested the attribution of degeneration and the assumption that there would be mental illness typical of tropical climates. However, despite condemning what he called a ridiculous prejudice of color and castes, as confirmed by Ronaldo Ribeiro Jacobin about the position of Moreira, I quote, he did not reject the theory of degeneracy, questioning only some casual factors of it, such as race, climate, and the stereotyped use of degenerative stigmas, end of quote. In 1903, Juliano Moreira became the director of the mental health hospital, Hospício Nacional de Alienados, in Rio de Janeiro. And even if he was still associating cultural problems with psychiatry problems, he innovated, humanized the treatment, ending, for example, with the use of stray jackets, removing the bars from all the windows, and separating adult patients from children. Nevertheless, he applied the organicist gem model of Emile Kraepelin, 1856-1926 in Brazil. Influential proponent of eugenics and racial hygiene. At the second half of 1910s, the conception of the Brazilian inferiority linked with racial inferiority and climate is losing ground by the adoption of hygienic medicine, meaning that the government should create public policies to sanitize its people. Our inferiority is seen as that point as the resulting from the lack of health policies. Brazil is a big hospital, said the professor and physician from the Faculty of Medicine of Rio de Janeiro, Miguel Pereira, in 1916. Eugenics became the program of the public health, a movement with the slogan, to sanitize is to eugenize. Manuel Bonfim, born in 1868, dead in 1932, was a Brazilian physician, sociologist, and psychologist, contemporary of Farias Brito e Juliano Moreira. In his book América Latina, Males de Origem, Latin America, Evils of Origin, published in 1905, he analyzed the effects of colonization. He was in the countercurrent of the dominant thought being against pseudo-scientificism, scientific racism, Arianism, social Darwinism, and against conservatism. He was also against all these forms of determinism that classify people from Latin America as inferior. Bonfim had a view of science as not only a descriptive tool seeking to understand the world, but also as an instrument at the service of the social transformation, recognizing that the subjectivity of science is not separate from the scientist's interest. Situating the scientist in relation to his object is a political question. In Latin America, argued Bonfim, the parasite will take care of educating the parasitized. That is a direct and clear image of the political situation in Latin America and in Brazil. So when the poet and modernist Oswald de Andrade, born in 1890 and died in 1954, launching in 1928 his Cannibal Manifest, announcing the cultural anthropology as the new possibility to think and live as people in the Western Hemisphere, he already had a predecessor that elaborated a strong argument against the colonial mentality. Oswald's inclusion of different voices implies that the written text includes the unwritten speech. For that reason, the resumption of the native speech inside of the text would lead us to a sort of complementary symmetry, allowing the reality to be reached and or rediscovered. For him, rhetoric plays ironically in a dynamic of hiding and revealing some units or parts of the discourse, where the ignorance reveals important power stakes. Incorporating the results of the Western heritage, Oswald deconstructs disciplinary holy lands, his political and expansive and barbaric anthropology. He advocates that the era is a value in and of itself. Having said that, we can confirm that the cultural anthropophagy, despite being elaborated from a non-indigenous perspective, and despite being a philosophy of the boundary, hybrid, participate of the process of indigenization of the research by deconstructing Eurocentric and patriarchal concepts, pointing out that the indigenous cosmology differs radically from the meridian religions, so-called world religions, and indigenize by attacking the inherent violence of the Western humanism. Oswald tried to revitalize indigenous knowledge, rehabilitating the native cosmology as far back as the end of 1920s. Oswald indigenized humanities from outside, as a non-indigenous. Before postcolonial and decolonizing studies methodologies, Oswald responded and faced the genocidal logic. Indigenous knowledge, different modes of existence, push back the epistemological limits of Western knowledge and its bondage to theology and science, that achieved the progressive substitution of natural things characterized today by the actual destruction and placement of our symbolic sphere, while it is anthropologized. There is unspoken text that scholars from ex-colonies even now avoid revealing. One of them is by dismissing metaphysical inquiry, saying that I would like to affirm that my relationship with metaphysics is somewhat unsettled because, again, the point is the difference between indigenous metaphysics and Western metaphysics. Does the practical dimension of metaphysics raised by Farias Brito make him an ally of the indigenous knowledge and ways of being? I'm not sure. What I'm trying to do here is precisely to reject the schizophrenic nature of Western metaphysics, to speak in the terms of Daniel Whitecat, and to review that to a certain extent we will find in contemporary indigenous thought analog critique. I quote Whitecat: American Indians must elaborate our own indigenous systems of metaphysics and contrast them with the dominant metaphysics of Western civilization. End of quote. Because the indigenous metaphysics is experiential, that is to say, I quote Whitecat, requires abstract concept formation in the service of experience. It rejects the schizophrenic nature of Western theologies and metaphysical systems in their abstraction beyond human experience. The experience is local. So Daniel Whitecat argues that education in the US, for example, I quote him, bears the largest imprint of Western metaphysics, and that the hope for American Indian education lies first in the explicit identification of features of the Western tradition of worldview that produce many of the problems we are immersed today, and secondly, in the active reconstruction of the indigenous metaphysical system. Western metaphysical constructs are antithetical to native culture and knowledge organization. My question is still open. How can or should qualitative inquiry in psychology incorporate the sovereignty of the indigenous ways of think and being?